The Democracy That Delivers podcast is brought to you today by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at CIPE. This is the podcast where we talk about corruption in its many forms. And now to your host.
Welcome, everyone, to the Democracy That Delivers podcast here at CIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise. My name is Gabby Cervone, and I'm a program associate for our Anti-Corruption and Governance Center. And I'm very excited to lead the discussion today that we'll be having on gender and corruption, but more specifically, the work that our guests from Chemitran are doing surrounding sextortion in Indonesia and more broadly, advancing gender and corruption in Indonesia. By way of background, sextortion occurs when those in power use sexual exploitation on those dependent on that power. In conversations surrounding gender and corruption, sextortion has long been a silent form of corruption, rarely discussed or recognized within traditional anti-corruption frameworks. However, it is present in both developed and developing countries and affect not only women and girls, but also other vulnerable communities. I'm joined today by Justin Snyder, Chief of Party for the USAID Integritas project at Chemitran, and Macy Sarbadia, the lead for the Integritas component on public education and participation in anti-corruption. And they will be discussing with me the work that Chemitran is doing in Indonesia surrounding sextortion and how the results from their work can contribute to furthering gender and corruption programming in Indonesia and globally. So welcome, Maisie and Justin.
Morning.
Hi. Morning. Thanks, Gabby, for having us. We're happy to be here.
I'm very excited, as I said, about this conversation. So we'll jump right in, and I'll kick us off with a first question is how did Chemitran sort of enter this gender and corruption space in Indonesia, specifically around sextortion?
Sure. Well, maybe I can help to answer that. It's a great question. Kemitraan has been involved in anti-corruption programming since the organization's establishment in the year 2000. Our organization was a key driver of the creation of Indonesia's Corruption Eradication Commission, or KPK, which has really been a shining light in terms of anti-corruption commissions within Southeast Asia, but also has been a global standout in many regards. Kemitraan has also been involved in shaping anti-corruption policy and its implementation for the last 2 decades. Kemitraan is also no stranger to gender programming, both from a human rights perspective and from a social inclusion perspective. We work on a whole range of programs related to gender and inclusion. Specific to the issue of sextortion, we've been given an extraordinary opportunity to implement USAID's newest anti-corruption program here in Indonesia called Integritas. And we find ourselves at the forefront of USAID's localization policy, which aims to empower more local CSOs and to diversify its partner base. Within Integritas, we are focusing on corruption prevention. And as we were looking at ways to incorporate gender-sensitive programming, sextortion rose quickly to the top of that list.
Yeah, it's very interesting, I think, when we look at sort of gender and corruption globally, and you can see, it varies across regions, and then very country specific kind of approaches to this work. Why sextortion specifically in Indonesia? What is it about sort of the current culture surrounding this idea that makes Indonesia such an interesting place to conduct this work?
Sure. So I'll try to give you a short answer on that. There are a number of things, and like you were pointing out, Indonesia has kind of a combination of factors that make it a very interesting place to be doing this work at this particular point in time. Recently, Indonesia passed a new anti-sexual violence law that was in 2022, and that has generated a lot of new momentum. Indonesia, like many countries around the world, has also experienced its own version of the Me Too movement. Um, that kind of gives some momentum to the issue of sexual abuse and sexual violence. Uh, but to tie that to corruption, around the world, financial corruption is almost universally condemned from a public morality or ethics perspective. Yet it is a problem that is perpetuated through a series of rationalizations, ranging from justifying petty corruption, like paying a bribe to get out of a traffic ticket, to grand corruption, such as the national identity card case here in Indonesia in 2019. Last year, our partner Indonesia Corruption Watch estimated that Indonesian state losses stemming from corruption cases um, that topped 2.8 billion US dollars, and that's only in last year alone. And that figure only comes from prosecutions. Those are that's a total of the amount that public prosecutors have stated in their indictments in cases. And so that obviously is only the tip of the iceberg. Um, while it's relatively easy to rationalize financial corruption, there are functional rationalizations that say, oh, civil servants are paid so low that they have to supplement their income, or there are social behavior rationalizations that everyone is committing corruption, or that bribery is a victimless crime. I think we're all familiar with a lot of those rationalizations. But sextortion, which I think you touched on a couple of elements of what we would define as sextortion. We look at it as simultaneously a type of corruption and sexual abuse. It occurs when a person with entrusted authority abuses their power to coerce an individual into providing them with a sexual favor. The sexual act or favor is an exchange for the person with authority performing their entrusted function. So when we look at that definition, it has three elements, right? The abuse of entrusted power, a quid pro quo, and the coercive power of authority rather than the physical use of violence or force. So when we are clear about the definition there is no way to rationalize that behavior the same way that there are rationalizations for financial corruption. Sextortion is universally indefensible from a moral perspective, and we view it as one of the most pernicious forms of corruption that exists. There is no plausible argument that a corrupt official was doing the wrong thing for the right reasons in a case of sextortion.
No, that is definitely a good point, and it brings up so many other questions about, looking not only within sort of the Indonesian context, but then looking outward globally on how that vision of sextortion is viewed in different countries, but how, the work that is being done by you at Chemitran, but also with different organizations, how that can translate kind of across borders and get everyone on the same page kind of regarding the steps that need to be taken in order to create successful programming to combat sextortion in all forms. And I'm curious actually about specifically the case study that Chemitran conducted with regards to university students. Maisie, would you be able to kind of discuss that a little bit and kind of what those results kind of yielded for you in terms of how you see this issue kind of being taken forward in Indonesia?
Yeah, thank you, Gabby. So I think in terms of looking at Indonesia as a home to more Muslims than all of the Middle East combined, I think relatively also our society is pretty much conservative in terms of morality, and in that framework, the topic of sex is often considered as a taboo topic of public discourse,
Mhm.
with perhaps the exception of same-sex relation and related regulatory efforts. So, before, like Justin mentioned about this law on sexual violence that passed in 2022, Before that, there was also many current cases happens on sexual violence cases happens in schools and university. And the Ministry of Education conducted a survey in 2019 where that led to an issuance of the ministry regulation on prevention and handling of sexual violence in tertiary education in August 2021. So at the time, the cases mostly happen between students in schools with teachers, and also lecturers with university students. When the Ministry of Education issued that regulation, actually there was a lot of controversy, because there was a misconception at that time that from the certain conservative religious groups that the regulation was aimed towards promoting extramarital sex, abortion, and child marriage. These groups
Mhm.
even filed a judicial review to the Supreme Court to annul the ministry regulation, but was then rejected. So good thing that in 2022 the law on anti sexual violence was issued. Then Indonesian society have a better legal framework to combat these offenses. And we also found that as a means of mediation, that often victims were pressured to marry their abuser, which then created another form of trauma for the victims, and no criminal punishment towards the abuser. Um,
Mhm.
our case study, sorry, our case study in 2020, in 2020, in this year, right? Sorry. Okay, our case study actually confirmed TI's Global Corruption Barometer Survey in 2020. TI released data on sextortion in Indonesia, where Indonesia is ranked the highest in terms of cases, and most of the cases occurred in law enforcement and education sectors. So, our study showed similar condition where sextortion cases occurred when victims are asked sexual favors in accessing public services. There's also confusion on the definition of sextortion. In a general sense, it is extortion to do sexual acts, sexual extortion. But what we are focusing also, as Justin mentioned, is the abuse of power and the entrusted authority aspect which public officials have. Furthermore, in the education sector, sexual violence cases is usually occurred where there is imbalance of power. We have seen right now is that there is also an improved awareness in schools and universities of sexual violence prevention and handling of these cases, but there is room for improvement, especially in the sextortion aspect, which includes creating safeguards for students, such as clearer case handling mechanism, more severe and unified punishment for abuser, and an effective whistleblowing system and protection which allowed victims to report. Good thing in the future, Gabby. I think we hope that our collaboration with Ministry of Education, where they put a serious focus to handle sexual violence in higher education institution, and also shows tremendous willingness to collaborate with us to make important advances in this regard.
Yeah, that brings up several, I think, interesting points. And the one thing that really comes to mind is when I was listening to you, Macy, is kind of looking at, you mentioned the gaps in understanding really, kind of the definition of sextortion. There's really kind of two schools of thought. And then hearkening back to your earlier comment about, Indonesia being a very unique case because, Indonesia has the largest Muslim population outside the Middle East. Do you find that those two sort of ideas kind of come in kind of combat with each other when trying to advance this work? Because they're being a conservative country and really having sort of this sort of still taboo, I guess, kind of vision on sextortion, do you see that as being part of the sort of um, hold on? Do you see kind of the dichotomy between having, a very conservative population, but also wanting to kind of advance sextortion, combating sextortion? Do you find those coming in conflict with each other?
Yeah, I think that is also an interesting perspective. Yeah, Gabby. I think what we're trying to do is to look at not only on the sexual violence aspect of it, but also to bring it into light about the factors of abuse of power and also the entrusted authority, where usually the talks about sexual violence or sexual acts are considered taboo, but when it is occurred in accessing public service, occurred where there's abuse of power of public officials, I think we have an opportunity to bring that further from a taboo aspect, but more on a public realm of rights of citizen to access services. Maybe Justin, you have more on this.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can just chime in with a couple of thoughts here. Just to add to that, I wouldn't say that there is a dichotomy between trying to push for more progressive protections from abuse and any kind of religious conservatism here. I think there's actually a tremendous opportunity to work together and in line with Indonesia's overall uh, kind of moral compass in this regard.
Mhm.
Because, again, as I was saying at the top of the podcast, this is an issue that nobody can defend, right? That nobody can stand up and say, "Oh, well, actually, no. This is a perk that I should enjoy as a as an entrusted public official. I should be able to sexually abuse people." You're never going to find that advocate or that opposition to progress. I think the idea that we can and we should be putting in place protections to make sure that women and men equally. This is not a women's empowerment program, but that people are protected as they are seeking the services that they to which they have a right. Um, I would say that this is also an issue that I think is relatively easily understood, particularly for male audiences, in the way that some gender programming can otherwise be difficult to develop kind of male allies for progress. At least in Indonesia, there's often a conflation between women's empowerment programs and gender programs, with gender programs being not focused only on women, but the differences in how women and men or male and female experience the world. Now, so I think working on sextortion and putting protections and handling mechanisms in place is something that most men, even the most conservative men, can be helped to understand very easily in terms of it doesn't take a tremendous imagination to understand how a policy, an improved policy, would help protect uh, wives and sisters and daughters from abuse as they are seeking the public services and the public education to which they have a right.
I completely agree with that. And I'm so glad you brought up this aspect of, this is sextortion is something that not only, affects women and girls, but it affects men and other vulnerable groups. And I think that that is a concept that sometimes when we're talking about, gender and corruption, there's this sort of mindset that it's only, targeting women and girls. But really, it touches, many different people and men specifically, and getting sort of men on board with that. And kind of highlighting the areas that they can be of or I should say, highlighting, how this affects them as well, I think is key and crucial to moving this forward. And I'm curious, actually, Justin, maybe this is more of a question for you, but have you noticed, not only sort of within Indonesia, but kind of looking outward, if there are any sort of other regulatory gaps, that you see in sort of advancing this work forward? I know that Maisie described, the Ministry of Education and their willingness and, to kind of move, to progress forward in this way, and the passing of that law in 2022. But are you seeing any other regulatory gaps that would hinder the progress, that we're starting to see, in advancing this issue?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gabby. That's a great question, and I'll do my best to answer it. But I will have to defer to Macy, who is our legal expert on the team on this topic. But maybe I can just start with a quick summary, and then Macy can add in the much more technical details. There are big regulatory gaps. And those are not only important in terms of regulation, but they also translate into challenges in prosecution. There is the law on anti sexual violence, there's the law on anti corruption. There are certain legal and regulatory frameworks for dealing with sexual harassment. But this issue of sextortion is one that manages to find its way and fall through the gaps between those three kind of major regulatory areas, especially when we also talk about terminology, right? So there is a certain amount of confusion and important distinction between the different terms. But sexual graft or gratuities, sexual bribery, sexual corruption, and sometimes this gets into issues of consent. Sometimes it gets into issues of, for example, the employment of commercial sex workers in order to provide sexual services as an alternative form of bribe, right? Rather than a financial bribe, a sexual bribe. So the regulatory framework is complicated. Unfortunately, there are some big gaps. The terminology kind of environment is also fairly complicated. And unfortunately, there are a lot of instances where terms are used interchangeably where they should not be. And so that creates some confusion. I'll just add one last point and then I'll pass it over to Macy, which is one of the things that our project is working on doing is helping to reform conflict of interest regulations in Indonesia. And specifically with relation to the topic of this podcast, making sure that sexual relationships, whether they are consensual or otherwise, are explicitly included in the types of close personal relationships that would constitute a conflict of interest. Again, this has been an area that has not been regulated, and so when you have a situation in which, say, a procurement official is having an ongoing sexual relationship with a potential vendor, anywhere else, or in many, I should say, in many other countries, that would be a clear conflict of interest, and that procurement official would have to recuse themselves or otherwise mitigate that conflict of interest. That area, up until now, has not been well regulated in Indonesia. And so that's an important area that we hope to make some changes on. Macy, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I think the challenges in terms of bringing these cases to the judicial process, as our study shows that cases that is controversial and then get a lot of public interest or goes into the media, usually it's just a tip of the iceberg of the many cases that has not yet brought up to the judicial system. One, because of there are many victims that felt insecure or not confident enough with the system to report these cases. And also because of that, what Justin mentioned about the unclear or the regulatory gaps in terms of the law. So, but although with that in mind, we also have besides challenges, we also have an opportunity. So, for example, now Justin mentioned about we have an anti-corruption law, we have also anti-sexual violence. So the gap between those two, if, for instance, if the sextortion cases proceed with this anti-sexual violence, there is opportunity to gain victims assistance, restitution, remuneration, restitution, compensation, and then the process itself. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the judicial process, the judicial officer that handle it has to be someone specialized with in terms of certification or expertise in handling sexual violence. But it does not, sometimes it does not added penalty or sanction where the abuse of power or the public officials that use the system, use their power to do this heinous acts, uh, get an added sentence. But in another aspect, the anti-corruption law is really clear on, higher penalty in terms of abuse of power, corruption, and perhaps if sextortion is used, if anti-corruption law is used to prosecute this, the issue is then those protection on victims, such as restitution, compensation, and protection, will not be able to be used. So that there lies the gaps of in terms of not just the law but also the implementation. And the third one is that all the law enforcement agencies is not fully aware about the situation, about what sextortion entails. There are cases where um, it's prosecuted differently. For example, there has not been any cases brought up by the Anti-Corruption Commission that related to sextortion because they don't have the authority yet to do that, because the anti-corruption law has not yet regulated about sextortion. On the other aspect, there's the public prosecutors also have their own challenges.
No, that's a really great point to bring up. And I'm really glad that you brought up sort of opportunities, because it really leads me into, looking ahead and looking forward, in Kemitran's work, in your work specifically, what do you see as kind of, the future going forward in this work in Indonesia, using these opportunities as kind of your segue? What is next for Chemitran in this sort of work and moving it forward?
Thanks, Gabby. I think what we're planning to do first is focusing on the education sector, particularly the tertiary education or the university. We are now having a campus integrity pilot, where one of the pilot is to deal with sextortion in a university in North Sumatra. And the idea is to have a policy and a better handling mechanism and protection inside the university to protect cases on sexual violence and sextortion. And other work that we're trying to do is with still with the Ministry of Education. We're trying to have a sextortion index, meaning we're trying to have indicators that can evaluate universities about their compliance of the ministry regulation in providing safeguards to students, and also a better handling mechanism of sextortion cases. And we also jointly with our partners, Ichewe, we're in the future we are developing a sextortion e-learning course in public education on anti-corruption. So we're having these modules inside the Ichewe's e-learning on anti-corruption called Academy Anti Corrupsi. And we're also trying to, we're currently drafting, right, Justin,
Yep.
the conflict of interest guidelines for public officials. So maybe you could add more on that.
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, that's another key piece. So, we can broadly categorize the work that we're doing on this in this area into the kind of education-focused work, like Macy just mentioned, and then the policy and policy implementation side as it applies to the civil service. So, we are very thankful that we've had a warm welcome from the Ministry of Administrative and Bureaucratic Reform, which is the key institution here in Indonesia, or one of the key institutions that manages the civil service. There's last figure I knew was about 4 million civil servants across the country, and so whenever they set policy, it applies to a tremendously large civil service, and so they are a really strategic partner for us. They have reached out to us after we had done some research on conflicts of interest, and they had approached us saying, "We want to work with you. We are in the process of revising this important regulation." And so we're very happy to have that partnership working because I think we can make a lot of difference, not only in the more kind of technical, cut and dried issues of conflicts of interest, but particularly and uniquely on this issue of sextortion.
That sounds great. I mean, I think that is the one aspect that, hearing kind of what is next in terms of your vision for this work in Indonesia, it really brings up to my mind how what you're describing is really should be fundamental when discussing this issue globally, and all of sort of these framework indicators, and being able to produce materials that educate the population and officials in, different branches of government, but also the general population on what this is and how we can begin to sort of combat that is really important. And I think that brings me sort of to my final point in this discussion is looking sort of outward. What do you feel is the key takeaway that other organizations around the globe can take from your work in Indonesia and apply it to their sort of plans to begin to tackle this issue on the ground in their own countries?
Yeah, I think, Gabby, I think what the lesson learns probably that the effort to combat sextortion should be a holistic and collaborative effort. So, meaning that it could, like Justin mentioned, about the approaches should be in terms of improving regulatory framework, improving the system and mechanism, but also in terms of public education. And it has to be a hand in hand collaborative effort between the civil servant or the government agencies and also the CSO, universities, and also university students and the community itself. Just it?
Yeah, maybe I would add to that. If I were giving a message to others who were looking at doing similar work, um, I think one of the things that's really important to remember and to recognize is that it's all about context, right? So Indonesia, like we were saying at the top of the podcast, Indonesia is at this very unique place in its own history. It's a very unique moment in time where there are new regulatory reforms that are already taking place. There has been a cultural kind of awakening to this problem. There is a growing awareness that also connects to the kind of growing global awareness around sexual abuse, and so those factors have all worked together. The stars have aligned, so to speak, to make this the right time for this work in Indonesia. That may not be the case for every country around the world, right? That may not be the case right now for Tanzania or the Dominican Republic or any other country you want to pluck off the map. So context matters. Cultural factors also are hugely important, and I think it's important to identify elements of kind of societal beliefs and cultures that connect with the goals that we're trying to achieve. Like I was saying earlier, sexual exploitation within the framework of corruption and specifically this issue of sextortion is a topic that nobody can get behind. It's an indefensible position. It's an indefensible behavior, and it really stokes moral outrage. But unless you have the regulatory pieces or the fundamental beginnings of the regulatory pieces, and unless you have some important case studies to be able to point to, developing much further progress on that is going to be extremely challenging. And I would even say, though, that within Indonesia's context, we are in this very unique moment in time, but we should have no illusions that this is going to be easy. Um, Macy was also pointing out that the Ministry of Education's new policy on prevention of sexual violence was very immediately misunderstood to be promoting extramarital sex and promoting child abuse and promoting abortion and a whole range of issues that it very clearly was not. So, in dealing with these very sensitive issues, communication is key, and uh, I would echo what Macy was saying is that partnership is also just fundamental to being able to make progress.
Yeah, definitely. I think all of those elements are key to any sort of good programming and progression of, various issues, not only within corruption, but also other international sort of issues that we are all combating. But I think you're right completely in saying, and you as well, Maisie, that specifically when it comes to this topic, it is one of the most important aspects in order to kind of advance this work forward. Well, that is all the time that we have for today. Justin, Macy, thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed our discussion, and I'm looking forward to Chemi-Trend's work in the future and seeing all of this come together.
Thank you, Gabby.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Gabby. We really enjoyed the conversation.
Yep.
We'd be happy to have you out to Indonesia sometime when we have a little bit more progress to be able to show. Maybe we can do another episode of the
Yes, I
podcast.
would love that. I would love that. Thank you both.
Great.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Gabby.
Listen and subscribe to SIPE's Democracy That Delivers wherever you get your podcasts.